So we've been talking through theories of international politics, and we've introduced the idea of realist theory, and now I'd like to talk through sort of the counterpunch to realist theory, liberal theory, which is historically been referred to as idealist theory, although I think liberal theory is probably the more common phrasing today. That having been said, I'm going to throw out some caveats here. One is that when we talk about liberal theory, we're not talking about liberal in sort of the leftist Democrat American political parlance of liberal. Liberal, when we're using in this class, means something different, right? So that contemporary political definition certainly is out there. That's just not how we're using it in this class. Typically, when we use it in this class, we're going to be talking about either classical liberal theory that emerged out of the Enlightenment, that believes in things like free markets and democracy and the idea of human rationality and reason, being able to deduce natural laws about the world, so gravity, that sort of a thing. Those classic liberal ideas, they make their way into this class, but those aren't really specific to international relations. And so when we talk about liberal theory today, we're going to be using sort of a third usage of liberal, what I might refer to as Kantian liberalism or Wilsonian liberalism or foreign policy liberalism. And that crosses sort of the political spectrum. In the United States, many Democrats are foreign policy liberals, but so are many Republicans. And what I mean by that is that they tend to support the ideas that come out of this Wilsonian vision of the international system and how to respond. So we'll talk about what that Wilsonian vision looks like in just a little bit. But before we get there, I want to flag one more thing about theories, and that is that theories should not be thought about as true or false. Theories are all false. They're all lies. They take an incredibly complicated world, a messy, complex, messy, awful, hard to understand world, and they render it down to a few elements. And ideally, a good theory will be able to take those handful of elements and explain a lot. And so the measure of a theory isn't whether it's true. The measure of a theory is whether it's useful, whether it helps us to navigate the world and solve problems. And so with that caveat, I now feel like I can sort of march forward and talk about Wilsonian liberalism or Kantian liberalism, because this is actually a set of ideas that dates back before Woodrow Wilson to Immanuel Kant, who in the 19th century put forward an essay called Perpetual Peace, in which he argued that the international system was trending toward a more peaceful future, and that wasn't necessarily going to be realized immediately, but he was looking at things that were happening in his own lifetime and seeing the trajectory of them and how they might fundamentally remake how the international system works. And so one of those things was the rise of international associations, forums for states to come together and discuss and debate and use diplomacy and work out rules for the international system. And so that idea that states can interact in a more orderly manner suggests that there's the possibility for greater cooperation and problem solving. Today we might talk about that as international organizations. And indeed, when Woodrow Wilson sort of picks up this idea of international associations at the end of World War I, he pitches the idea of a League of Nations, a formal institution where states can come together and resolve differences, where the common security and the common defense of everybody within the international system will be part of that organization's mission. So one component of this Kantian tripod of three changes that Immanuel Kant is seeing is that international associations piece. The second piece that he sees is the rise of republics. So republics are juxtaposed against monarchies, which are ruled by a royal family where sovereignty is rooted in the monarch, whereas republics, sovereignty is rooted in the people. And that those republics can be democracies in which people have an actual sort of say in political power, or they can be ruled by some sort of authoritarian structure. But again, the idea of the legitimacy and the source of a state's authority derives from the people. And Immanuel Kant looks at this and says, that's a different kind of political model. A state that's ruling and governing for the well-being and the good of the people is likely to behave differently than a state that's interested in, amassing greater family holdings. And I think in the contemporary era, that idea of this shift toward republics really has been picked up on by foreign policy liberals, who note that democracy has a lot of institutional and normative factors that are going to push states to behave differently, that are going to maybe make them better equipped to resolve problems through negotiation rather than force, and that the accountability that comes with democratic institutions seems to lead to better and potentially less destructive and violent foreign policy. So we see that as a change in the international system. And then the third change that Immanuel Kant was pointing to was the rise of interstate trade, that as states become intertwined economically, their economies are going to become locked together in such a way where suddenly trade conflict becomes really difficult. And so all three of these pieces ended up being pushed forward by Woodrow Wilson as part of his 14 points at the end of World War II to try to translate these trends that Immanuel Kant was seeing shaping the international system, to translate them into actual policy on the ground that would remake the international system in a way that would be more stable and more conducive to cooperation. So that tends to be the thrust of where liberal theory sees the international system going. That there are changes that can happen and can be brought about and can be encouraged that fundamentally will reshape the international system in a way that will be more cooperative and more stable. And so we can sort of take that aspiration, what folks in the past might have called idealism, and translate that into sort of specific tenets of liberal thought, right? So one of the things that liberal theory tends to champion is the idea that yes, the international system is anarchic, right? There is no central authority, but cooperation is still possible. And they see that for a variety of reasons, one of which is that liberals tend to emphasize absolute gains versus relative gains. And this is something that we talked about previously when talking about realist theory, that realists tend to think about power in terms of, am I doing better than you? Am I gaining ground on you? And that comparison of wanting to beat or do better than everybody else makes it really difficult to cooperate. Where liberal theory tends to focus on absolute gains, am I doing better today than I was doing yesterday? And that's progress and that's success. And conceivably, we all can do better tomorrow than we're doing today. And that creates much more space for cooperation because states are focused on improving their objective condition from where they are today. Okay, so cooperation is possible under anarchy is a core thought in liberal theory. A second core sort of tenet is the idea that states are rational actors. Just like with realist theory, there's the assumption that states kind of know what they want. They are conducting a cost-benefit calculation to sort of figure out, does this make sense? And then they're acting strategically in a unified and coherent way to try to achieve those goals. So we can probably understand the behavior of states because they're behaving in a rational manner. Not necessarily rational in the sense of I agree with it, just I can understand their thought process and their calculation. Third, states are important in liberal theory, but states are not the only actors in liberal theory. States certainly play an important role, but international organizations like the United Nations, like the World Trade Organization, even non-governmental organizations like Greenpeace or Amnesty International all play a role in the international system and are part of a global network that facilitates cooperation. Similarly, multinational corporations are going to be a big part of the story of international politics, because if you're thinking about trade as a fundamental linchpin that ties economies together and ties countries together, multinational corporations are oftentimes the vehicle that makes that possible. So from liberal theory, you need to think about not just states, but other actors as well, because they play an important role in the connections that we see. And then finally, liberal theory would say that states are focused on a wide range of issues, right? They're not just focused on security the way that realist theory would sort of suggest states are. They're also thinking about economics, they're thinking about environmental cooperation, they're thinking about, energy, they're thinking about human rights. There's the long list of things that states care about, hosting the Olympics. And because of all those different issues, there's all these different possible forums for states to cooperate and interact. And that, again, builds sort of this dense network of interconnectedness amongst states that makes conflict more difficult. Okay, so we have these various different tenets of liberal thought, and I want to kind of pivot back to how that leads to a different way of thinking about the prisoner's dilemma, our sort of metaphor for conflict and in an anarchic environment. And while realist theory really told a story about sort of, I guess, a one-shot prisoner's dilemma, in which you're making your choice to cooperate or defect one time and you get your reward. Because liberal theory is thinking about these dense networks of interaction where states are going to be interacting over and over and over in multiple different forums, in multiple different environments, they would argue that it doesn't make as much sense to think about the prisoner's dilemma the way it's oftentimes just presented, as you make these choices and that's that. You get your result. They would say that the prisoner's dilemma, as it's experienced by states when we think about anarchy, is actually an iterated prisoner's dilemma, in that we play the game over and over and over, that every day we get up and make a choice about whether we're going to cooperate or defect, and every day we have to make a choice about whether we're going to cooperate or defect in any one of 100 different arenas in which cooperation and defection are occurring. And that changes the game considerably, because when we're sort of stepping back and thinking about that prisoner's dilemma game, mutual cooperation tends to be understood as the best outcome, broadly. Maybe I could do better by cheating, but broadly you can sort of look at that and say, this seems like not a bad place. Everybody is improving their condition, and certainly compared to the outcome that realists would predict of a defect outcome where everybody's turning on each other, mutual cooperation would have benefits. Benefits in terms of absolute gains. We will be doing better than we were before. And because of that, liberal theory would say that repeated interaction and that desire to sort of get to that mutually beneficial outcome is going to create a pressure on states to try to build cooperation. This is sometimes called the shadow of the future. The possibility that we might be able to get out of a defect, cheat each other equilibrium and move to a stable pattern of mutual cooperation is going to be enough of a incentive that states might try cooperation. If it doesn't work, that's fine. They'll switch back to defection. That's the tit for tat strategy that we had talked about earlier for how you navigate the prisoner's dilemma. But if it works, then you try cooperating again. And if you can successfully build trust, if you can build confidence, you have the potential to realize the gains from mutual cooperation through a process of reciprocity. I attempt to cooperate. If you cooperate, I continue. If you don't, I'll punish you and respond in that way. So while the prisoner's dilemma as a metaphor for anarchy is oftentimes tossed around and is oftentimes presented as a source of pessimism for why the international system is likely to be awful, liberal theory tends to look at that and see they see a challenge that can be overcome and managed through cooperation, reciprocity, and trust building. One final thing I want to flag about liberal theory is that, like all theories, there's oftentimes policy implications that come out of those theories. And so one of the liberal theory actually ends up having two pretty common interpretations that folks who think about this idea of how do we build a more stable and peaceful international system usually come down in terms of one of two camps: the liberal hawks or the liberal institutionalists. I think I have institutional liberals, although I'm not sure I think liberal institutionalist is probably a better term. But they generally disagree about how acceptable it is to use military force to try to transform the international system. Right? And liberal hawks tend to argue that the source of awfulness in the international system oftentimes resides with specific bad actors, that you're getting these networks of cooperation that are working and are being built up, but there are dictators or there are pariah states or there are rogue states that are existing outside of that system and are threatening that system, and military force is an acceptable and perhaps even a necessary response to defang those potentially dangerous states, possibly through regime change, and replacing their governments with governments that are going to be more amenable to integration into this global network that's going to facilitate cooperation, right? And so advancing a stable international system is a legitimate reason to justify or legitimizes military force. Liberal institutionalists tend to be more skeptical about that. They think that the pathway to building a stable international system is not through the aggressive confronting of states who are outside that system, but to really build up and strengthen that system. So building up and strengthening international organizations and the rule of law, working to sort of cement norms of cooperation, trying to maximize the benefits from that system as a way of drawing others into it and sort of locking them into that system in a way where conflict and rocking the boat becomes just too difficult. And that's really the solution, and that potentially even attempts to use military force to stabilize the system might actually erode those norms of cooperation, might exacerbate fear in the international system, and may actually be counterproductive to the project of building an integrated and a networked and connected international system in the way that Immanuel Kant was sort of envisioning would take place, and Woodrow Wilson has, and his 14 points, sought to try to accelerate and put into practice.